I would like to go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker of the day. Avi is the co-director of Mount Madonna Center, which is a retreat center and intentional community for yoga. She has a master's degree in sustainable management for business and public administration. Wow, Avi, that is it's quite the deal. She focused her study on intentional communities because living in communities brings her a deep sense of purpose and peace, and she believes that it's a choice that should be made available to everyone. So welcome, Avi.
Thanks, appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. Good to see your faces. Let me get my screen going here. All right, so today we're going to be talking about serving differences. But before we get started, I'm going to ask for your participation. This is kind of a quintessential Avi feature, sticking to it because we're all in this together. So let's take a moment, and I'd like you to reflect on what it means for you to be different. So you can write this down on a piece of paper or open up a document on your computer. But in whatever way it works, I do want you to make note of this because we're going to reference it later. And specifically, I'm curious, in what ways do you experience being different in your community? Just take some moments. It doesn't have to be an exhaustive list. Do you try to think a little outside the box? Like for me, I'm not a morning person. One way I feel I'm different from some. I'll give you just a few more moments. And again, if things kind of occur to you as I continue talking, feel free to write them down. So, in what ways do you experience being different in your community? All right, so as Karen said, I'm the co-director of community well-being at Mount Madonna Center, which means that my mentor, Kalpana Kachuk, and myself, we get to focus on connection, communication, and now COVID, which will come into play in a bit. So, pictured here is a moment in time of both residents and our extended community at our first annual reunion retreat last year. I first came to this community in 2011 and have either lived here or been involved ever since. We are a multi-generational community with about 70 current residents, including a few families, a couple dozen founders who literally built the place, and one silent monk. So though we have a ways to go in increasing our overall diversity, we do hold quite a bit of differences here, which is something I'm quite comfortable with, as this is my family. We're kind of adorable, right? You know, I figured it couldn't hurt to put a little baby picture up there. Anyway, I grew up in a loving home where differences were very much the norm and celebrated. My mom is Black, my dad is white. My mom is a practicing Catholic, my dad is a practicing Jew. My mom is loud and outgoing, my dad is quiet and understated. People would often ask, how does this work? My parents always said that they went in knowing that it would be work and that they were both committed to doing it. From my point of view, these differences were never seen as a problem that needed to be fixed. My parents didn't try to change one another. They loved each other as they were, differences and all. So growing up with these pronounced differences gave me a deep appreciation for living in and with diversity, and an ability to see differences as bridges to common ground rather than barriers to connection. Such beautiful magic can happen when we shift from a mindset of tolerating differences to one of serving differences. So though my story is pretty unique, the good news is I bet most of you already serve differences when you provide communal meals. So we're all aware that we have different tastes, we have different nutritional needs. So a communal meal typically offers options to accommodate some of these differences. At Mount Madonna, pictured here, we offer non-dairy, gluten-free, and vegan options. Well, we also have boundaries about what we will offer, such as no meat or eggs, garlic, or onions. And believe me, that one's a little tough to take. If a person needs something that we don't offer, it's at their time and expense to provide it for themselves or to choose not to live in our community. Now, the beautiful thing about it is these differences don't stop with just what we choose to eat. It's also about how we choose to eat it. So given the same options that you just saw, one person's plate can look completely different than someone else's plate or bowl. It's kind of incredible, right? All the various ways that we can experience the same thing. This is just a dozen. It's not even all of it. One of these plates isn't necessarily better than another. One plate doesn't negate another plate's value. And yet in one meal, we've served all of these differences, which has created a richer experience for everyone involved. Okay, so you're probably thinking like food's easy, right? But what about like the really hard stuff? So let's keep this food analogy in mind as we look at another recent example of differences in action, for which I'll offer 5 key lessons learned. So enter COVID. Now we often say that Mount Madonna is a microcosm of a macrocosm, which you might also relate to. So I suppose it should have come as no surprise that given our society's stark differences of opinion to the response of COVID, we would also experience it in our community. To mask or not to mask? And indeed, that's the question. It's amazed me, actually, how this has turned out to be one of the biggest differences that's been so hard to overcome. When the virus first hit, we had a range of responses from one community member who doesn't believe in germs to another who became terrified to leave their home. About half of our residents are in the vulnerable category, so the level of risk is also quite different for our members. And we, as directors, had to err on the side of caution in order to look out for the whole. But the more protocols we put out to keep the community safe, the more unrest developed in our community. Some of our residents felt unheard, undervalued, and disempowered. Some didn't agree with our response and thought we should have isolated ourselves entirely so we could treat each other, all 70 of us, as a big family without the need to wear masks. And yet others continued to shelter in their homes and appreciated the safety that the protocols offered them. So as the months went on, these differences led to more and more disconnection. And after a few key instances of some residents not wearing masks, we realized we needed to face these differences head on. Now, I must admit, I was pretty resistant to this. I was quite frustrated and fed up with talking about why it was necessary to wear masks. And I felt like having more of these conversations was a distraction from all of the important work that we had to do. Which brings me to lesson number 1. This is the work. Sure, it wasn't the topic that I wanted to be focused on. It wasn't really the way that I wanted to engage. It was the work the community was asking for. And it would ultimately become the type of community building work that I love. Just because something doesn't look the way that you thought it would, doesn't mean it isn't the exact thing that you had hoped for. The work that needs to be done is often the work that is right in front of you. And the key is to recognize it as such. So for me, that happened when I caught myself saying, if only. If only they would just follow the protocols. If only they could understand that our actions affect other people. If only they could see that wearing these masks would allow for more personal freedoms. And then it dawned on me. I was stuck in the counterfactual, the thing that would never happen. It didn't really matter what might have been. It only mattered what was. So there I was in another meeting hearing about how people didn't feel heard. And it wasn't until I was informing the directors about it that it finally dawned on me. I consider myself a good listener who creates space for others to be heard. And yet when asked why a certain community member felt the way they did, I couldn't answer. And I realized I hadn't listened well enough to be able to understand their point of view. So now I had some self-work to do. Lesson number 2, listen first. Okay, so clearly I needed to listen, and I knew it would be a bit of a struggle since, let's be honest, I didn't really want to hear it. So I asked myself, what process would help me both feel heard and be able to listen to someone that I may not agree with? And this led me to listening pairs. So listening pairs is a structured conversation where partner A shares about their experience for 5 minutes, while partner B just listens. Then partner B asks any clarifying questions needed to further understand. And when ready, partner B repeats back what they heard in first person, beginning with, I am a resident. During this time, I've experienced blank. I figured that starting with, I am a resident, would help to emphasize our common ground, that we are all residents here having different experiences. So once partner B finishes repeating back in the first person, then the partner switch. Okay, so we had our process, listening pairs. Now I needed to test it out, and I needed a partner. And that's when it hit me. If I really wanted to do the work that needed to be done, I had to ask the most vocally dissatisfied member to do this listening pair with me, AKA the one that I really didn't want to listen to, right? So I put my big girl pants on and I went for it. And honestly, it was mostly an enjoyable experience and definitely worth it. At first, I found it really hard to speak his experience as if it were my own. And yet, as the words came out of my mouth, I felt the understanding sink deeper and deeper into my being. We both agreed that hearing our story reflected back in first person especially allowed us to feel more heard and understood. Plus, we even discovered that we both had the same goal, to create more unity in our community. We just had different ways of going about it. Okay, listening pairs. And as I began to promote it to the various groups and invite them into this process, my partner even became an advocate for it, helping to encourage others to come and share about their experiences. So now it was time to gather our resident community on Zoom, of course, and practice listening to one another. Lesson number 3, lead with love. Now, in my humble opinion, I think love is the ultimate common ground, even though it means something different to each person. It often reminds us to come from a place of compassion and kindness. Even saying the word love can evoke these kinds of emotions. And when we stop to listen to one another, we allow space for that love to enter in and for understanding to take place. So leading with love means focusing on feelings, which are neither right nor wrong. Can't really disagree with how someone feels. It's just what it is. What we can do is listen to one another's experience without needing to believe in the same thing. So in this way, we can meet each other simply as individuals who care for one another, allowing us to be on the same side, to be for rather than against. So during the meeting, we invited the expression of feelings in, giving permission for all kinds of experiences to be shared. I intentionally paired people with residents that they don't often connect with in order to create a richer experience. And after 20 minutes in the listening pairs, we returned back to the main room. We asked everyone to share back what they learned in their listening pairs and encourage different voices to speak up. And almost everyone said they wished they'd had more time because the experience was so intimate and valuable to them. And most importantly, you could feel the love in the room. Just want to celebrate that for a second. It was a big moment. All right, so now that our differences were welcomed and out in the open, it was time to talk about masks. And I knew I was not the right person for the job. Lesson number 4, ask for help. This particular meeting needed to be facilitated well, since it was likely to either bring us closer together or pull us farther apart. And even though I'm pretty confident in my facilitation skills, I also knew that I had the potential to be reactive. So I stepped down and I asked for help. It was absolutely the right move. We needed a facilitator who could be as neutral as possible and set the tone for people to feel comfortable sharing. And the facilitator who stepped up did a brilliant job of holding this difficult space. She began by acknowledging that this is a tough time and normalize the experience of behaving not as our best selves. She ended with a poem that emphasized the opportunity to deepen our relationships during these times of conflict or tension. We also asked our community for help. As my mentor Kalpana says, we trusted the wisdom in the room. So we began by stating the boundaries. Remember those? The boundaries of what we needed to maintain the health and well-being of our residents, mainly a consistent practice of wearing masks and maintaining physical distance. And then we posed the question, given the differences of opinions and preferences, how can we move forward together? We received some valuable and very practical input, which we used to draft a mask agreement. This includes language such as, we trust in each other's good intentions and acknowledge that we are all doing our best. We lead with kindness and curiosity if we see someone without a mask. And we check in with ourselves to make sure that we're not in reaction mode. In situations that are unclear, we use our best judgment and we respect each other's boundaries. Now, it's not perfect, but we almost have about 100% participation in signing the agreement, which for us is kind of huge. And since adopting it, I haven't experienced any instances of non-compliance. Now, this may be due to the fact that the masks were never really the issue, even though that's all people wanted to talk about. The masks were actually just masking a deeper issue. Okay, cool, thanks. Finally, lesson number 5, own the impact. So one of the biggest surprises was that the unrest or the discontent was less about the protocols themselves and more about the process through which they occurred. It was not a collaborative process. We did not ask for input. We moved quickly, and the protocols became more and more constrictive. Now, when the directors discussed it, we all agreed that we made the right decision. When the virus first hit, as you may remember, there were so many unknowns. And it felt like each day a new piece of information required us to adapt and create new protocols. And in a very short period of time, life in our community changed quite drastically. Now, this experience is not unique to us, of course, as COVID is also the ultimate connector of sorts. But it did make me realize that while I was a part of making these decisions, others were simply affected by them. And that didn't feel good to them. They were hurt, and that hurt fostered distrust. Now, none of this was our intention, of course. It was, however, part of the impact. And for that, I apologized. I acknowledged the damage to our relationship that resulted from our actions. And while I wouldn't change what happened, I could at least own the impact. Now, that apology seemed to have the greatest positive effect of the entire process. It felt good to hear it, they said, and it made a real difference. So sometimes, all it takes is stating what is true, even and especially when it seems obvious to you. So finally, after months and months of tension, I'm now experiencing more connection in my community. And while we still differ in our opinions and risk tolerance, it also feels like we are moving together as a community. As my mentor from grad school, Donna LaSala, recently said, 2 things can be true at once. I find this helpful to remember when dealing with difficult people, especially. It's quite easy to write someone off because they sometimes act like an asshole. And yet, I've also experienced that person as extremely caring, insightful, and able to see things in other people to help them grow tremendously. So that person can be both asshole-ish and amazing. And even though my life may be easier without them, I do believe that they make it better. So living with difference means cultivating an ability to live in this in-between, to allow 2 or more seemingly opposing things to be true without needing one to be more true than the other. Instead of living in either or, we have the capacity to hold the both and. So there is unity in diversity. Now, as promised, let's look back on what you first wrote down when I started. In what ways do you experience being different in your community? And now I'd like you to consider how you might use these experiences of being different to connect more with your community. What might it look like to do a listening pair with someone? And who might you choose to share your story with? So if you would, one more time, I'd like you to write down a commitment to share your experience of being different with someone in your community. This commitment could be a person's name or a particular moment that you would like to share about your experience, or a deadline to do it, but whatever feels right, consider what you're willing to commit to use your experience of being different to connect deeper with your community. I'll give you a moment. It's funny, I can't see everyone, but I'm using Sue as my person since she looked up, so I'm gonna, or they looked up, so I'm gonna move us forward. But I appreciate that commitment. Keep that in mind throughout this day in particular, and how we might carry that forward. So in the words of Mr. Rogers, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. The people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone. So let's use our differences as bridges to connections and invite others into these opportunities to deepen our relationships. It's not just that I believe this way of living to be possible. I know it's possible because it's who I am, it's where I come from, and it's how I choose to live my life. It takes work, it takes commitment, and it takes a whole lot of love, and it's totally worth it. So thank you for your time and attention. I hope the rest of the conference is meaningful, inspiring, and moves us closer together. So feel free to reach out and connect. My email's on the screen. And thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Avi, for encouraging us to, well, do all kinds of stuff, recognize our differences and to celebrate them within our community and work through some stuff. So thank you.